I'm Bob Bixby, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. Welcome to our virtual forum on raising the debt ceiling. Can they avoid a crisis, and what happens if not? I'm very happy to be joined today by two people who have been in the room for past debt limit discussions. They are Jason Furman and Rohit Kumar. Jason is an economics professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Formerly, he was a top political, well, I should say economic advisor to Presidents Clinton and Obama. And he has a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Rohit Kumar is co-leader of Washington National Tax Services at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's a former senior advisor to Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell and was a senior policy advisor and counsel to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. Rohit has a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. And today they will join me to discuss how we ended up back on the brink of default, what would be the consequences of a default, and how might policymakers avoid that result. You can submit questions if you would like through the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. If you do want to submit a question, it'd be helpful to include your name, and if you're with the media, to tell us what your affiliation is. I will say that we have a pretty large audience today, and the depth of knowledge about the debt limit ranges pretty wide. So there are folks who are just getting interested in the issue, and there are other people that have been covering it for years. And so I'm going to try to indulge both audiences and ask everybody to be understanding. So if you're new to the debt limit and we get a little bit weedy with some of the issues, well, just, try to hang in there. On the other hand, if you're an aficionado on the debt ceiling and some of the questions strike you as a little bit elementary, keep in mind that some people are new to this issue and just getting to know the joys of the debt ceiling. With that, let me get started with our panel. So Jason and Rohit, you were both involved intimately in the last, well, we've had several debt limit crises, but a lot of times what's happening now is being analogized to the 2011 debt crisis, where we came within a couple of days of default. You were on opposite sides of the negotiation table on that. And I wanted to know, just first off, if there were any differences, major differences between 2011 and now that you can see. Jason, I'll start with you.
So great to be with you, Bob. Great to be with my old friend, partner in crime, Rohit. There's one thing that's obviously in common. You have a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, and a Republican House. And that means whatever comes out of this is going to have to be something that both parties agree to, which means it's going to be something that neither party is happy with. It certainly won't be something that when I look at it, I am happy with. Going into this, you had a president who was concerned to not repeat the experience and do less to negotiate over this, to do less to accept so-called hostage taking, as he calls it. And you had a speaker who had a narrower majority and a group of people within that narrow majority that were more motivated to get as much as possible out of this. And so in some sense, the starting place was different. I think the last thing is, last time, I think there was a little bit of an open mind towards wanting to actually do a grand bargain for deficit reduction and a belief in that, I think, on both the Republican side and the Democratic side. This time, that definitely wasn't true on the either side. It's not like the Republicans were willing to give revenue in exchange for entitlements. And it's not like Democrats really wanted to do that deal either. So I felt there was always less upside this time around.
Yeah, I would in general agree. you have the structural similarities between the two. You have this newly discovered but long available tool in the House called the motion to vacate the chair, which complicates the life of a speaker. But on the other side, in 2011, we were laboring under a requirement set forth by then Speaker Boehner that every dollar of debt limit increase had to be accompanied by a dollar of spending reduction, not a dollar of deficit reduction, but an actual dollar of spending reduction, which made the task before us quite challenging, and in my mind, dramatically upped the odds of defaulting on our debt, because there was an objective metric that you had to hit. Whereas, at least in this transaction, as Jason alluded to, entitlements are off the table. We're not having a serious conversation, or even a non-serious conversation about entitlement spending. As best as I can tell, the requirement, the stated red line, is spending reduction and reforms or something that's pretty broad and to some degree inchoate, and it allows a lot of potential landing spots that would meet the stated criteria without anyone having to acknowledge that they got, that they had to compromise on some deeply held principle. So frankly, having an objective standard that we had to hit in 2011, I felt like at the outset made the transaction much more difficult to execute than the one that they're facing now, where the requirements for success are somewhat more loosely defined and therefore easier to achieve.
And before we get into some of those negotiations and how they're going right now, I want to just do a little bit of introduction to the debt limit as a concept. For one thing, Jason, why do we have a debt limit? How did it come about?
I mean, first of all, one thing to understand is other countries don't have this. This is really an American thing. It's because the Constitution assigns Congress the authority to authorize the issuance of debt. It used to be that just every now and then you issued debt, so Congress could pass a law each time. World War I, all of a sudden we need to issue a lot more debt. To simplify that process, Congress says you can raise debt up to this amount and then come back and check with us after you get to that, and then we can always raise the amount. We've had that rule in place for a bit over 100 years now. It's been raised about 100 times now. We've never gone into the situation where you went past the date at which it needs to be raised. And the vast majority of those 100 times have been, with basically no drama, and you wouldn't have been doing a Zoom, even if Zoom had existed then.
Back in World War I, at the beginning of the Zoom age, Rohit, does the debt limit prevent Congress from enacting new spending and tax policies that increase the debt, or does it simply prevent the Treasury from borrowing to pay for the policies that Congress has already enacted?
Yeah, so it ends up being the latter, although there would be an argument for every time Congress enacts a new policy change that would increase the deficit or the debt, that they would have to accompany that with an equivalent debt limit increase, so that it would be sort of self-executing. But we don't do it that way. We pass laws that spend money or reduce revenue or some combination of the two. And then later, often months or sometimes not years later, we hit the statutory debt limit at whatever number it's been set at. And just as a reminder, while it may seem to many viewers like this is sort of an insane way to run a government, you have to remember it would be even more insane in a relative sense to have Congress be voting every time we had to issue new debt, which we do now, regularly. So at the time that they did this, it seemed like a process improvement, and indeed it was relative to where we were before. So you just have to contextualize. We got here not because some Congress 100 years ago thought this will be a fun thing to do every 18 months. They thought this is something that we don't want to do every week or every month or with any kind of degree of regularity. So we're going to give more authority to Treasury than they had in the past. But again, Bob, back to your question. Yeah, no, we don't. This doesn't in any way prevent Congress from doing, enacting laws that would increase the deficit on an annual basis or the debt on a overall basis. It just is at some point the bill comes due, and now you have to negotiate, how you're going to sort of, frankly, increase the ability to borrow to pay those existing obligations.
Yeah, it would seem to make more sense if it was part of the regular budget process some way rather than an add-on. And we can get to that later as to what ways we might be able to improve. Jason, another thing, just as a preliminary matter that I wanted to talk about is the concept of default, because I hear that term. I think people are talking past each other sometimes when they say default is not an option, because I think they may be defining it differently. I think a lot of Republicans define it as to be defaulting on explicit Treasury securities, missing an interest payment on debt, or not being able to roll over debt. Others define it more broadly to mean the government missing any payment, to whether it's to beneficiaries, contractual partners, or grants to states, or anything, missing any obligation. So how should we define default?
So after the X date, the government will be in a situation where the law has told it to spend more than it can collect in taxes, and it's not allowed to make up the difference with borrowing. And so one of the commitments it's made will have to give. The Treasury's never said what it would do in that circumstance, but certainly what we know about last time, and I was there last time, is that the Treasury would pay its principal and its interest on the debt. So it would not be defaulting on the debt. Instead, what it would do would be to reduce or delay or prioritize its payments of everything else, which, under most definitions, meets the definition of default as well. You're defaulting on obligations. You're not defaulting on your debt and interest obligation. You are defaulting on other obligations by paying less or paying later than what you had been contractually obligated to do, or what the law told you to do.
And in either case, it may have an effect on how people perceive your creditworthiness.
Yeah. Oh, and Fitch has already put the United States on notice of downgrade. S&P downgraded us last time, even though we averted the problem before. So I don't think the ratings agencies would be that patient by, dancing on the head of a pin, trying to define exactly what default means.
Rohit, I had another sort of definitional question here. Is the X date? I hear many reports about June 1st is a deadline. And I worry a little bit about that. If we get to June 2nd and the sky hasn't fallen, people will say, well, see, there's no problem, or we knew that Secretary Yellen was just trying to jam us on the debt limit increase. And so could you explain? I mean, it's not that precise. There's sort of a range of when the government's going to run short, and it's all based on uncertain projections. Is that right?
Yeah, no. So I think the issue here is, and I have a lot of sympathy for the folks at Treasury who have the obligation to try to project this stuff out. The challenge is, we collect revenue kind of every day of the year. And you have some projections based on historical precedents of, we think we'll get roughly this much revenue, say in the month of May. And in this situation, the issue is, it's sort of binary as to whether we can get to June 15th or not. June 15th is an estimated payment deadline. Federal government collects some revenue. And then on June 30th, we get some additional extraordinary measures authority. And so if we could get to June 15th, we could kind of leapfrog seriatim all the way to the end of July and into early August. And so there is this question of, well, can we make it? And right now it doesn't look like we can, and nothing that the secretary has said recently would suggest that we can. But, she has, I think, understandably said, look, these are based on projections. I will update you as actuals kind of come in. But I have no reason to think, and I think her sort of most recent communication has been pretty clear, we should not, under any set of circumstances, assume that we're going to make it to June 15th and therefore be able to bounce our way all the way to the end of July. And so now she has said, and this is where it is a little challenging, she has said, even in her most recent, slightly more refined communications, look, it could be as early as June 1, but it might be a couple days later, but not weeks later. Earlier communications had said it could be weeks later, which opened up the possibility of getting to June 15th and then, leapfrogging our way all the way to the end of July. The most recent communication no longer sort of holds open the possibility of weeks, it's rather days. And so, whether it's June 1st or June 2nd or June 3rd, I think is still a little bit in question. But frankly, I do expect that at some point, if not later this week, then certainly early next week, we will get another communication from the secretary that sort of starts to nail down, no, it is actually June X, whatever the X date ends up being. It might still be June 1. Maybe it's the 2nd. That's my birthday. That would be fun. But we're going to get a date, and then that's going to be the date that we have to work against. And at some level, while again, I have deep sympathy for the folks that are trying to do this, Congress needs a real deadline, right? Like Congress needs to know this is the day, work backwards from this day in terms of your own legislative internal process. And then when you have to cut the deal. The fact that there's at least a potentially couple days of wiggle room is giving what's happening right now. I think they're operating on the hypothesis that it's not necessarily June 1, that it might be the 2nd or the 3rd. And so they don't have to strike the deal today on May 25th. They might be able to wait and strike the deal, on May 26th or May 27th. And that is probably still okay. But, obviously the sooner we do this, the better in terms of removing the uncertainty from the system and the risk that everyone assumes, or not everyone, but at least one party assumes that it's not June 1, it's June 2nd or June 3rd. And then we find out on the 2nd, no, it was actually June 1.
Yeah, and just to put some context on this, Bob, the federal government right now has $77 billion on hand. Now, if any of us had that in our checking account, I think we'd be pretty happy. That is 1/10 of the cash they had a year ago at this time. That is 1/3 as much cash as a high-end phone manufacturing company called Apple currently has on hand. And given the unpredictability of revenues and bills, that's just not something you'd ever want to do as a federal government if you weren't forced into that position.
Yeah, I think if you do have questions about the government's position, you can, if you really want to, you can check that daily treasury statement, and the first line, the first box is the cash balance. And yeah, I've been looking at that, Jason, and it's been down. The 77 billion is nice. It got down a little bit before that. So yeah, that's scraping the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, I think traditionally, at least my memory in 2011 and maybe in subsequent negotiations, is $25 billion is sort of seen as the bottom of the barrel. Anything below that, and you run a risk that you have a payment that ends up zeroing out the account. And as a reminder, these payments are highly automated, given the number of payments that are being made. That's to be expected. And so the system is not really wired much below $25 billion to build in some sort of fail-safe. So 77 is, more than 3 times 25. So that's good. But as in the context of the federal budget, relative, say, to our own personal bank accounts, $77 billion is just not a lot of money.
No, you can have that amount of payments come in on one day, potentially, if it's a big payday.
Oh, I mean, you also have a banking situation, which right now is a little bit quiescent, but you never quite know. And that's certainly making them more nervous than was the situation in 2011.
Not that I would want to alarm anybody. I just wanted people to know that if we get to June 1st and the sky hasn't fallen, just wait. It may yet. Okay, so it's just sort of rounding out this the debt limit 101 section. Regardless, and you may have different perspectives on this, but regardless of how one feels about the debt limit, we do have a legitimate long-term debt problem in this country. Is that would you agree with that in one degree or another?
I think. Oh.
Yeah.
Jason, I'll start with you.
I think we have a fiscal sustainability problem. I certainly think if we extend the tax cuts without paying for them and ignore Medicare and Social Security using gimmicks to get through them, I would expect our debt to continue to rise as a share of GDP. So at some point, something needs to be done about the trajectory. I think just those steps, by the way, would get us a long way. But on the current course, yes, we have an issue.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody that, well, there are a few, maybe just a handful, that would disagree with the premise that we are on an unsustainable trajectory. The challenge, as it is in the very micro with the debt limit, and whether it's June 1 or June 2 or June 3, at a macro level is, eventually it's unsustainable, but eventually is not a deadline. And as I said previously, Congress really needs a deadline. They need some action forcing event. And it's not clear to me what is the action forcing, the near-term action forcing event anyway, with respect to the unsustainability of our fiscal trajectory. We have some things that are 8, 9, 10 years out, insolvency of Medicare is one, and a little bit further out is insolvency of Social Security. Although insolvency is a little bit of a misnomer, it's the trust fund, which is itself a little bit of an accounting fiction, runs dry, and then the Social Security checks just get reduced by, I think 23% is the current projection. So, 1 week you're getting $100, and the next week you're getting $77. And that, the last time we had big Social Security reform was sort of in the shadow of one of those events happening. This is Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, so this was ages ago. So that's an action forcing event, but it might not be soon enough is the problem.
Well, there also is the possibility that Congress would do what it's done with the Highway Trust Fund, and sometimes in part with Medicare, which is form some gimmick, some general revenue transfer to get itself out of doing the type of thing it did
Right.
in 1983.
Yeah, that solves the near-term trust fund, Medicare Highway Trust Fund problem. Doesn't, of course, address the underlying issue. It just shifts the balance from the trust fund that's insolvent to a general fund that will eventually be insolvent, but perhaps later.
Well, I guess the issue in this context is, does the debt limit help any of that? I mean, you wrote an op-ed together, the two of you, in 2017, in the Wall Street Journal, in which you concluded that the statutory debt limit has outlived its usefulness as a mechanism for restraining the size of the national debt. Or put more precisely, we think that whatever residual value the debt limit may have is far outweighed by the risk that a potential U.S. default poses to the global economic order. Do you still think that's true?
I certainly do. This is to borrow a phrase, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. The amount of risk that we incur, to me, is far in excess of whatever potential hypothetical value we get in terms of deficit or debt reduction, in part because history has shown us that we don't use this to make the hard decisions, right? We're not having a grand bargain conversation. Even in 2011, when we were trying to have a grand bargain conversation, or by we, I really mean Speaker Boehner and President Obama, I was not directly involved in that aspect of the talks. It failed. And so, this has not proven to be an effective tool of fiscal restraint or fiscal sustainability, but it does continue to present, so this is an existential threat to both the US and ultimately global economy. And so I think this is not working and presents outsized risks to the economy. And so we would be better off investing our energies and thinking about a better way to think about the fiscal trajectory question that doesn't involve putting a bomb underneath the US and global economy.
Yeah. My only disagreement with Rohit's phrasing is I'm not sure it's always juice when you're squeezing. And, look, if we had not had a debt limit in existence, we still would have needed an appropriations bills. We still would have, that still would have been a compromise. It probably would have been about the same spending level we're going to end up with here. Now, let's say you think maybe spending's a little bit lower because of the leverage that House Republicans had, then go back to 2019. Spending discretionary may have been a little bit higher as a result of the leverage that congressional Democrats had then. So I don't even know that you're getting, I think you're not getting very much change in the trajectory of debt from this. I'm not even sure if the change in the trajectory is positive or negative. If you raise interest rates, by the way, that's actually bad for the debt. So, whatever's coming out when you're squeezing is not worth it.
Well, and Jason raises, I think, in this context, especially a particularly valid point, which is you think about the topics that we think are, in the mix for a debt limit solution here, right? Discretionary spending caps. Well, you were going to need those anyway, because you have to have an appropriations process. You have to have what we call a 302A congressional budget parlance, the top line spending number. Permitting reform, both parties have wanted some version of permitting reform going back several years now. This is a useful vehicle for carrying it, but it is not like that this would not have been that you were leveraging this for something. Both sides wanted this. We're sending some COVID money. Again, you could have gotten that as a part of the appropriations process, and even the possibility of work requirements, at least with respect to the food stamps program, could have easily arisen and likely would have arisen had not arisen here in context of reauthorizing a farm bill or the farm bill programs. The farm bill carries both food stamps and agricultural support payments. So many, frankly, if not all of the things that are likely to be a part of a debt limit negotiation here could have easily and entirely foreseeably been done on some other piece of legislation also in 2023, and probably to this roughly the same substantive outcome.
So you could have basically the same negotiation that we're having now, but without putting the U.S. creditworthiness at risk.
Right, which is kind of gets back to, at least for me, the fundamental point of the 2017 op-ed, which is what we're getting out of this is not worth the potential risks that we incur.
Let's you know, a lot of people hear about the debt limit and think it's, you know, they hear the back and forth and it's just typical Washington blather, and probably are thinking to themselves, you know, why should I care about this issue? So as we turn to the consequences of default, Jason, I'll start with you. I mean, why should people care about this?
Yeah, so first of all, just getting close in 2011, we saw a dramatic decline in consumer confidence. We saw interest rates go up, and we saw the stock market really slide. All of that was probably bad for the economy right then. Back then, you couldn't quantify it, and that was getting it done on time. If you go past the date, there would be several types of economic consequences. One set would operate through consumer confidence and business confidence and investment and spending choices they make that add up to what happens in the economy as a whole. A second would be through financial markets, where rising interest rates and falling stock market would make it harder to access capital, borrow, grow, and the like. And finally, there's just literally the government spending less money would have a Keynesian effect on the economy, eventually leading to a contraction. What is the magnitude of all of this and on what timetable? No one knows, because we've never tried it here in the United States. No one has ever done this in any other country either. I liken it to, you might be shooting yourself in the toe, which is unpleasant, but not horrible. You might be shooting yourself in the hand, and you might be shooting yourself in the head. Moreover, each day you go past the debt limit, the X date, you'd be loading the gun again and firing it again. And so if you hit the toe the first 3 days in a row, on the fourth day, maybe it would end up being your hand. So we don't know exactly what time scale, but we know it's all bad. None of it's good. And the question is, how bad and how quickly does it become bad? And hopefully we'll never know the answer to that question.
Well, those are some of the imponderables on the economy. What about the effect on the federal budget, Rohit? What would be the immediate effect if we went over that X date?
Well, so my memory is we collect about 3/4 of what we spend. So you would immediately cut federal spending by effectively 25%, whether you actually just stopped on 25% or you did effectuate that by delaying payments, which might be the more, if you're going to manage your way through the crisis, might be a better path forward. But so you would have an immediate reduction in federal spending, but not in a thoughtful, let's think about where we want to prioritize spending kind of way, but more of in a haphazard, like we're just going to take a meat axe to the federal budget. And look, there are almost certainly some elected officials in the Congress today who think a 1/4 reduction in federal spending would be an acceptable policy result. They don't have the majority in either chamber, but there are certainly some that probably subscribe to that point of view. But I don't think there are any that would take the point of view that 25% reduction in federal spending ought to be just done sort of haphazardly. They would have a theory of the case as to how they wanted to reduce federal spending. They would not sign up for indiscriminate reduction in federal spending, whether that's Medicare or Social Security, which both parties have said they should not be on the table for, a conversation, at least not in this transaction, or defense spending or NIH spending, or, whatever it is. There would be something there that people would object on both sides to being reduced. So, it's a really foolish way to go about achieving something, even if you're ultimately in agreement on the goal, which again, I don't think there is 218 votes in the House nor 60 in the Senate for a 1/4 reduction in federal spending. And to sort of Jason's fundamental point, while we don't know exactly the result, the range of options are somewhere between bad and sort of unimaginably bad. Like there's no happy story of default and then better things follow. It is only how bad will it be.
And that spending cut, because you're right. I mean, I'm sure there's some people who say, well, all right, a 25% spending cut, that's great. But it's a phony spending cut in the sense that it's only a delay. I mean, you're only not spending because you can't borrow, but it's not canceling the obligations that that generate that spending. So, unless there's an accompanying policy change that changes the spending, you're just sort of building up a big stack of unpaid bills, isn't that?
Yeah, I mean, look, at some level, I mean, if you were to just play out the hypothetical to its extreme, setting aside the devastating economic consequences, if you just never raised the debt limit, right? We just sustained it where it is today, for the infinite horizon, right? You would eventually then, I assume you'd have to authorize the Treasury Secretary or some executive official to make some decisions about which bills we're going to pay and which bills we're just not going to pay. I can't imagine any member of Congress would be comfortable just delegating that level of authority to the secretary, but that's effectively what you would be doing. Again, this isn't a world where you default, you go past the X date, and you never clean it up. Now, you'd have that would create a whole set of other problems. So I think at that point, the least of your worries might be who has the authority to decide which bills we're going to pay, because you'd be grappling with, over the long haul, to use Jason's analogy, eventually the self-inflicted injury would be fatal. And you'd have much more devastating economic consequences to wrestle with than like who gets to decide which bills get paid today.
Right, because there would be the issue, for example, the unemployment rate would rise to approximately 100%. You'd have 150 million people collecting unemployment insurance.
If you
Jason,
chose to pay the bill.
Tapping into your executive branch experience on that question of prioritization, that's kind of vague. I mean, Secretary Yellen has said she didn't have the authority to prioritize, but there is some thought that interest payments on the debt would be able to prioritize. But beyond that, it gets pretty murky. So going back on your experience, was there a prioritization plan in 2011? And what do you think the situation is now?
Right. So prioritization, people mean two different things by it, depending on who you're talking to. One is that you will pay the principal and interest, and then you'll do something to everything else. That is most likely technically feasible. There's a little bit of ambiguity around whether the systems can do that, but most likely the systems can do that. And most likely that is what the government would do. There's then a second thing that some people mean by prioritization, that within the tens of millions of payments the federal government makes, it can sort of pick and choose and say, we'll pay this one, we'll delay that one, we'll haircut that one, and we'll do it in some rational, pleasant way. That second aspect of prioritization within the non-principal, non-interest is very unlikely that the computer systems are set up in a way they could do that. Very unlikely that there's any official that would be willing or able to make the choice about how to do that prioritization. And there's legal questions, I should say, around all of this. So I expect the simple prioritization, principal and interest, but the prioritization within everything else, I think that's unlikely that would happen.
I think the other, frankly, the more, to me, immediate political issue here is, so let's say you do option one, where you pay the principal and interest on the debt, and then you either delay everything the payment or haircut it, or however you manage together tens of millions of payments. The political issue that presents is, let's take one step further down the sort of analysis chain and think about, okay, who are the ones getting principal and interest payments, and who are the ones who are taking a haircut on their otherwise payments? And while there are a lot of U.S. citizens, U.S. nationals, and U.S. pension funds and the like that hold T-bills, you also have a lot of foreign sovereigns and sovereign wealth funds that invest in Treasury securities that would be getting paid first ahead of Medicare, Social Security, the troops, et cetera. Right. So I think at some level, it becomes politically unsustainable to be paying some foreign sovereign who has a lawful obligation and lawful claim to U.S. dollars ahead of a more politically sympathetic domestic constituency. So this argument has always puzzled me, because I think if you just look one layer below, the politics of it are frankly pretty terrible for a U.S. elected official.
Speaking of U.S. elected officials, now let's take a look at the negotiations that are going on I guess it's pretty much been narrowed to the Biden and McCarthy teams. What's your assessment of the, whether or not they have a shot at reaching a deal in time to avoid a default? Jason, you want to begin with that?
I think it's likely that they'll reach a deal. Now, that deal may stretch a few days after June 1st, depending on the timetable for voting. The House needs to be able to look at legislation for 72 hours. I don't know exactly what that would mean to go a few days after June 1st and whether there'd be some ultra short run extension that could go faster or something like that. I haven't heard any discussions of that, but I think they'll probably reach a deal. I still very much wish the House Republicans had passed a clean debt limit. If they hadn't passed a clean debt limit, I wish they had done this with vastly less drama, which is the way it's happened the vast majority of times this has happened before. So I think it's a bad place that we're in timing wise, but I think we will probably scrape by.
Yeah, I am also generally optimistic that they will find a way to get this done before we hit the X date, whether the X date's the 1st or the 2nd or the 3rd. And I think that comes about in kind of one of two ways. Either we, once we have a revised X date, whatever it is, we just get it done in time. There's always ways to expedite the legislative process, especially in the Senate, which is the place that has the greatest potential for sort of procedural delay, even if the substantive result ends up being identical to the non-delayed version of it. Or if there's an agreement in hand and it is literally a matter of we just can't get through all the legislative steps in time, then not just on debt limits, but on a host of issues, Congress is always able to find a way to extend the deadline by passing some, as Jason referred to it, ultra short-term extension. I'm talking now about like an additional couple of days, a week at the most, but not something to the end of June or September 30th, or, there were earlier sort of hypotheses that there would be some several month short-term extension. I never really thought that was plausible. And even now, I don't think it's plausible. And I think the only way you get a short-term extension is once you have the deal in hand and both sides have, shaken on the deal and they're in the process of just literally drafting, scoring, and then working your way through the 72 hours in the House and then the issues in the Senate. That's a place where I could see maybe a short-term extension having, political life. But we are at least a week away from being able to have that conversation in a serious way.
Yeah, there's some very interesting dynamics taking shape here. We've talked a little bit about the timing that's, pushing these negotiations forward. So now as some leaks begin to come out about things that they're agreeing on, there are factions on McCarthy's right and Biden's left that are saying, well, we don't like these terms and we won't vote for these terms. So is it possible to put together enough votes from, bipartisan votes in the House and Senate to support something that McCarthy and Biden could agree to? I mean, and is the goal here to try to make sure that everybody can claim victory? Not everybody, but I mean that both Biden and McCarthy can claim victory. Can they do that, and B, can they get it through the House and Senate?
Yeah, so admittedly, I spend very little time worrying about a McCarthy-Biden agreement not having the votes to pass the House and the Senate. I spend no time worrying about the Senate. Anything that will pass Speaker McCarthy's House and get signed into law by President Biden will have 60 votes in the Senate. Maybe the harder question to answer, although I don't worry about not having 218, is what exactly is the coalition of votes in the House? I think as a general matter, if you're someone that thinks that the House passed bill as written should be the final product and nothing less, you're not voting for the final agreement. And there are 35 House Republicans that sent a letter today saying not one thing less than what the House passed, or else we're probably voting no. They were always going to vote no. And likewise, if you think the 14th Amendment is the beginning, middle, and end of the answer, then you're also probably not somebody who's going to be a part of the coalition of the willing that gets this thing across the finish line. And so, look, I think it's a general matter. If it's not an even split between Democrats and Republicans in the House, it's pretty close to even. I'm not even sure right now whether I could handicap that you get more Democrats or more Republicans in the House. But I think you're going to get a healthy number of both because Speaker McCarthy is not going to reach an agreement that doesn't get a significant number of House Republicans to vote for it. And I believe, although Jason might tell me I'm wrong about this, that if President Biden signs off on something, that is between his signature and then his own political effort in the House, will be able to garner significant support amongst House Democrats. No one's going to bat 1,000, and they don't need to bat 1,000. They just need to produce roughly equal numbers. 120 from each conference would get you there.
Jason, is it a problem for President Biden that he said he would not negotiate on the debt ceiling? Is he now negotiating on the debt ceiling? I mean, or can both sides say, well, we were negotiating over the debt ceiling, and the other side will say, no, we weren't negotiating over it, so long as they get something done. But do you think that could be a problem?
Some of this is like words that people use, and I don't quite know what those words are. They're having a negotiation right now. The president's drawn a distinction between negotiations that would have happened anyway for things like the spending level for this year, which as Rohit pointed out before, and I pointed out before, that negotiation was going to happen whether or not there was a debt limit. And, in some ways, something like 2011 was dollar for dollar. If you give me an extra dollar of saving, I'll give you an extra dollar on the debt limit. In some sense, there was a direct quid pro quo between what you were agreeing fiscally and what you got in terms of the debt limit. That link is not present here. The negotiations are largely over what would have needed to be negotiated anyway. So I guess to me, that's, a certain amount of semantics. In one sense, yes. In another sense, it's a little bit different from just a pure debt limit negotiation.
Look, I mean, if I'm the administration, if the deal looks something like what we think it's going to look like, and I'm the administration, I'm trying to spin this as, why I didn't get my pants stolen in the negotiation. I say, look, the things we gave were things we were going to have to give anyway, either here or somewhere else, or the negotiations, the items we negotiated were going to have to be negotiated one way or another, right? Permitting reform we both want, discretionary spending levels were going to have to be done anyway. Work requirements on food stamps, that was going to show up in a farm bill negotiation. So whether I agreed to it as a part of a debt limit conversation, or I was going to have to agree to some version of this anyway, it's kind of, form over substance. The substance is likely the same. Oh, and by the way, look at all the things that were in the House passed bill that did not get done. We protected all the Inflation Reduction Act credits. We didn't defund the IRS. We didn't pass their, the major regulatory overhaul, the REINS Act that was in the House passed bill. So the sort of extremeness of the House bill from the perspective of House and Senate Democrats gives the administration some immediate potential wins, because there's a bunch of stuff that's not going to be in the final package that was in the House passed bill. And if you're Speaker McCarthy, you can say, President said he wasn't going to negotiate. We passed a bill. We got him to negotiate. We got these spending reductions. He would maybe tell a different story, which is, yeah, maybe we would have had a 302A discretionary spending conversation as a part of the appropriations process, but we got a better result because we did it this way than we would have the other way. There's no way to prove the veracity or the lack of veracity of that statement. It's just a judgment call, but it's exactly the sort of thing that gives political leaders the ability to take the exact same agreement and tell a slightly different story to each of their caucuses about why they got what they needed out of the transaction.
Yeah, this kind of leads to the last thing I want to talk about. And we do have a couple of questions that I want to leave time for. But where does this leave us? I mean, so we have this kind of vague negotiation where they debating over the debt limit or not. Are we at a point where holding the creditworthiness of the United States hostage is in effect the only way we get things done? I mean, I do worry about the breakdown of the regular budget process. We were talking about how a lot of what they wanted to do here, they could have done through the regular budget process. And as Jason pointed out, you still have the shutdown option at the end of the fiscal year. And yet this fight has been staged over the debt limit. It's in where there are much greater consequences. And do you think there is a potential for this just being regularized?
Look, Bob, you said in your question, is this the only way we can get things done? We get barely anything done this way. Rohit and I had that contentious debate before that when you squeeze the thing, did juice come out or did something considerably yuckier than juice come out? But whatever it is, it's just not that much. Maybe got slightly higher discretionary spending in 2019, maybe slightly lower this year, or maybe they were both the same as what they would have been anyway. So this has not been a successful way to force meaningful action on the debt. So I would scrap it. If you can't scrap it, the Bipartisan Policy Center put forward a thoughtful proposal. It said if Congress puts forward, I believe it's a concurrent budget resolution, but Rohit can correct me if I get the terminology wrong, then it automatically increases. If they can't put one forward, then the president has to put forward deficit reducing legislation, and whether or not Congress passes that legislation, the debt limit effectively automatically gets raised. So I think something like that is a little bit clunkier than just repealing it, but either one would be a big improvement over what we do now. And then in terms of deficit reduction, I don't entirely know, Bob, sort of what the forcing event will be. One could be markets. If interest rates go up, in some sense, deficit reduction isn't that pressing right now, and financial markets are telling us that. At some point, they may tell us something different. I think that's part of what motivated action in the 80s and early 90s, where interest rates were a lot higher than they were now. Deficit reduction, I think, was more important back then. And then the other thing is the Social Security and Medicare solvency dates, I think, are really great forcing events that, we should all be prepared to do something. Now, I think we should do things mostly on the revenue side. Rohit probably thinks something different. And, that will be the debate and conversation that needs to happen.
Rohit, do you have any favorite debt limit alternatives?
Yeah, so look, I'm also a fan of the BPC's proposal. It's called the Responsible Budgeting Act. It was introduced last Congress by Congressman Arrington and Congressman Peters. Congressman Arrington is now chairman of the House Budget Committee, Arrington. To me, the most you get out of the debt limit, and this is being generous to the debt limit, is you force at least a conversation about our fiscal path. Now, we've not actually used that conversation to make meaningful change. But if the most you get out of the debt limit today, and again, at the risk of defaulting on the debt and blowing up the financial system, is you force a conversation, well, let's think about what we're getting and can we replicate that without, triggering the consequence of defaulting on our debt. And I think the Responsible Budgeting Act does exactly that. It forces at least once a Congress a serious look at our current fiscal trajectory and asks Congress the question, are you comfortable with this? Are you prepared to make the hard choices that you heretofore have not been willing to make in order to right-size the state of fiscal ship? It doesn't require Congress to do anything, just as the current debt limit exercises don't require Congress to make the hard choices. In fact, so far, we typically have avoided making the hard choices, but it just forces the conversation because those hard choices are only going to happen when the political stars are aligned for those hard choices to be made, whether that's because of markets or the trust fund insolvency or whatever it is, whatever the external forcing event is that causes the political stars to align. Why I like the sort of BPC proposal is it forces us to have the conversation on a regular basis so that in the event the stars have aligned, we don't miss an opportunity to execute on the transaction. And we can do so without holding the full faith and credit of the federal government hostage, because so long as you have the conversation, even if Congress decides, we think we're good with 120% debt to GDP ratio, wherever we are at the time, as long as they have the conversation, the debt limit is increased. So you use it to get the thing you really are getting today, which is at least a conversation. And I would argue the conversation that the BPC proposal encourages is actually a more serious conversation than the one we've typically been having, but it de-risks the whole exercise. And that to me is the real value. And that's not to say that it's the only solution out there. It's just, to me, having been thinking seriously about this, at least since 2011, is the sort of most complete kind of replacement for what we get today, while also taking the risk out of the system.
I do have some questions from our audience members, and I'll consolidate a little bit. As you probably can guess, we've had some questions about the 14th Amendment, and the issue there is whether the 14th Amendment, whether the debt limit is unconstitutional because of the provision in the 14th Amendment that says that the debts authorized by law shall not be questioned. Jason, did you folks look at this in the 2011 crisis, and what was your conclusion?
The lawyers in our administration were skeptical of it. I don't know what the lawyers in this administration think. I think this is certainly a gray area of the law. I'm not a lawyer, by the way. Rohit is. There's a gray area of the law. There's ambiguity here because there are conflicting statutes. But one thing in the Fourth Amendment is it does say, as you just said, as authorized by law. And so if you borrowed past the debt limit, you could argue that wasn't authorized by law, that borrowing. And I should say, I think if there's a gray area, that I would be nearly certain in my prediction that the Supreme Court would rule that it was not constitutional. And some people say, oh, they'd never cause chaos and the destruction of the global economy. If they did the ruling, they'd say you get to keep issuing this debt for another month, and then Congress and the president have to resolve it. I don't think the Supreme Court is going to, in a gray area, step in and support the president's negotiating position in a negotiation with the Republicans.
Yeah, look, I've spent some time thinking about this, and there was certainly a period of time in 2011 where I was rooting for anything that didn't require Congress to pass a statute, because I didn't think Congress was going to be able to pass a statute. So I was, briefly in the Platinum Coin fan club and the 14th Amendment fan club and the anything but passing a law fan club. But I think the issue is, as a general matter, courts try to read statutes kind of in harmony with other statutes or other requirements. So if there is a reading of the debt limit statute, which was enacted clearly after the 14th Amendment was ratified, they will find a way to read them in harmony. And the obvious harmonious way to read it is the debt authorized by the debt limit shall not be questioned. And moreover, you could argue, okay, well, you're going to pay the principal and interest. That's 14th Amendment obligated. But the 14th Amendment doesn't say that you get to roll over the debt. You get to issue new debt. And it certainly doesn't say anything about paying Medicare recipients or Social Security recipients or anyone else. And so I've actually always, not always, but certainly recently thought this argument is actually, I think, kind of dangerous because it empowers the prioritization sort of crew on Capitol Hill to say, see, this is easy. You just pay the debt. 14th Amendment says you'll pay the debt. So you pay the bondholders, you make the interest payments. What's the problem? Right? Of course, the problem is you're not making other payments. You have the economic risks. You have the sort of uncertainty factor. All right. And then the other piece of it is, let's just say you invoke the 14th Amendment. I, as a bondholder, I am surely going to demand a risk premium for buying debt issued after the X date, because there's at least the possibility that the Supreme Court is not going to be on board with this exercise. And then there's just like the practical matter, which is I'm having a hard time conceiving of a court of recent vintage that is less likely to take a flyer on the 14th Amendment than the current one. So it seems like if you are a 14th Amendment fan, this is probably not the court that you want testing the hypothesis against.
Yeah. Now there is one idea that's I think is completely legal that's barely been discussed, which is the Treasury can mint as many quarters as it wants to. You could make $1 trillion worth of quarters. The only issue is that would require 23 million metric tons of copper, which is more than the entire world produced last year. So I'm not sure that could be done in the next week.
Right.
Well, here's we have had a couple of questions that you might guess also that people wonder about Social Security and Medicare. And let's just talk about Social Security. I mean, and the issue is there are trust funds, and what does that mean? And we can't get into. We're only got about 5 minutes left. We don't want to get into too much of the metaphysics of federal trust fund accounting, but I really do think that people have a legitimate right to be thinking as they hear about this debt limit thing. Is this going to delay or impact my Social Security check? Jason, you want to take a quick shot at that?
Yeah, it's the Social Security interaction is very confusing because depending on whether you keep Social Security's excess funds in Treasury special bonds, which it currently does, or keep it in an accounting ledger with the federal government, you get different answers. So there is one version of a plan put forward by your colleague at the Concord Coalition that would buy us several years. I think that's worth studying. I'm frankly skeptical that it would pass legal muster and work in markets. There's other sort of technical things you could do where you keep more money out of the Treasury specials because that counts towards the debt limit. And maybe that could buy you a little bit of time measured in days or weeks. But I think most likely, if you did anything like that, you'd do it in conjunction with prioritization, not as an alternative to it. So I don't think there's a magical solution here, but everyone should study all the different options if they need to.
We did have a question on going into a little bit different area here. Is would default have some bearing on things like support for Ukraine or a new pandemic or some dealing with the current pandemic anyway? But anyway, do you think it would have some effect on say America's, let me broaden that to be America's standing in the world, to act as a international leader?
I mean, I don't know how it couldn't.
I
It's
would
sort of
say
hard to-
yes.
yeah,
Of course.
it's hard to imagine a scenario where our standing in the world is improved because we have defaulted on our debt and triggered and self-inflicted an economic crisis, not only on ourselves, but perhaps on the rest of the world. It's hard to see how that's a pro-American diplomacy move in the grand scheme of things.
And I have heard it argued that we do have the long-term fiscal problem, and so it's so bad that we might as well default now and get the pain out of the way. I imagine that is
beyond nuts. I mean, beyond nuts.
Very technical term Jason's using here.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, but
our debt, I personally think we could stabilize our debt at 100% of GDP. I think we could stabilize it at 150. Maybe you need to stabilize it at 75. Who knows? Any one of those numbers we can get to with spending and tax changes passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. Probably not in the next week, but over the next period of time. And people lend us money at a low interest rate. Why? Because they know we're going to repay them.
Yeah, to me, the analogy I've been thinking about in my mind is it's as if I went to the doctor tomorrow and they said, okay, you've got this illness, and if we don't treat it, it will ultimately do you in. And my response is, unless you can guarantee me full cure, we're just going to expedite the transaction and do it today, right? The thing we are trying to avoid, if you can't promise me that it will never happen, which is of course not in life is not true, but in fiscal stability might be true, unless you can promise me a good result eventually, then I'm just going to expedite the bad news and we're going to do this today. I mean, that's sort of the thing we're worried about. If we can't promise a solution today, then we're just going to expedite the consequence that we are trying to avoid and make it happen tomorrow. It just seems completely, well, to use Jason's term, it's nuts.
Next time I'm going to give that answer. I like that one better.
Yeah,
that is a good answer. Yeah. Does anybody, as sort of a final thing, want to speculate on what the ultimate deal is going to look like here?
Bipartisan. How about that?
Okay.
I will agree on that, but I do think we'll want to take stock and figure out, even if there's a deal, this was a terrible process. It hurt our standing just even coming to where we've gotten now. We need to figure out a much better way to deal with this in the future.
I certainly agree with that sentiment and hope we will do so. We have run out of time for this segment. I want to thank our guest, Jason Furman of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, a wonderful school, by the way, where I got my graduate degree, and Rohit Kumar of PricewaterhouseCoopers, a wonderful firm where my father was a partner for many years. So I think that both of you guys must have all the answers with those connections. And I want to thank our audience. We will have this entire interview posted on our website fairly soon. And so you can check it out and send it around. We will have it as a episode of our podcast and radio show Facing the Future. This is Bob Bixby, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. Thanks for joining in.